My name is David Green. I'm an alcoholic addict of many sorts. I've been blessed with a gift of recovery since August 8th of 1994. I live in Oklahoma here in the USA, and it's really, really good to be back with you guys. I missed a couple of weeks due to a post-op infection that I ended up with in my foot, and it just kind of took me out for a couple of weeks. And at first, I thought it was going to be much longer than that, but I trust God in these situations today after all these years. I used to would have had a plan, but really I don't have a plan. God's plan is being revealed as we go. And as I mentioned earlier, there was a beautiful German nurse that really reminded me of that while I was in the hospital and, just how good God's grace is. And, I'm sorry to say that my friend Lee will not be joining us. She has decided that, or she's had other obligations that's come up and decided that she needed to give her full attention to those. So moving forward, I will be doing the study. I've done a lot of these by myself, so I mean it's nothing new. And but we will definitely miss her. She's a beautiful person, and I love her a lot. And we, to the best of my memory, or at least that's where we're going to pick up today, is going to be on page 111 in the big book. And we are into the chapter to the wives. And we talked a lot about, the wife being as addicted to the alcoholic or the addict as the addict or the alcoholic is to the substance. And I didn't know this for a long time. I've been in a lot of crazy relationships that never really worked out. I always thought it was them, but after 5 or 10 of them, after a while, you get to thinking that's not them anymore. It must be me. And so, this is going to give us some good principles to live by today in these readings. There are some things that we will take a definite in-depth look at. And I'm really excited to share that with you guys. And the alcoholic is not the only one that suffers from the spiritual malady. It's also those that are as bound to the alcoholic as the alcoholic is to the alcohol, as the addict is to the drug, the lust, the sex, whatever it may be. And for a long time, I couldn't understand that. I can remember going into Al-Anon meetings in my early part of my recovery, and I would talk with those people, and I remember asking them, how can you be powerless over alcohol? Because that's their first step as well. How can you be powerless over alcohol if you don't even drink alcohol? And there again, the behavior, the control, the deception, trying to talk me into it no matter what to get sober. All of the things that they do to try to heal the alcoholic, except for God. I know we do it in the name of God, but usually He's the last on the list. But, it's all of those things that I do whenever I drink alcohol or whenever I don't drink alcohol. It's crazy how the illness is. And so, today on page 111, it's going to give us 6 principles of success. And we're going to take a deep dive into those and take a good look. So we're going to pick up right here on page 111. And it says here, the first principle of success. Now remember, there's going to be 6 principles that we look at. And this is going to be our first one. You should never be angry. Oh, wow, really? I mean, that's going to be pretty hard because I do a lot of things that bring a lot of anger to people through my behavior and through my actions as an alcoholic. But the first principle for success, if you are not alcoholic, if you're bound to the alcoholic, that principle of success is going to be that you should never be angry, even though your husband becomes unbearable and you have to leave him temporarily. You should go, if you can, without rancor, in other words, resentment. And it says here, patience and good temper are most necessary. So, really not operating from a place of anger. Now, if you are in recovery, you have an alcoholic in your life. If you're in a recovering alcoholic who has an alcoholic in your life, and this begins to happen, it's saying the best place to do this is not to operate from a place of anger. So, how do I do that? And if you guys know me very well, and most of you do, I like to jump around in the book and I like to see how the book connects. And I want to find out what other pages set me up for ideas that I can use in order to do this. So, if you don't know already, we're going to hold your place there and fall back to page 67 in the book. And this is what the book calls the sick man's prayer. Now, as I come through this part of the work with my guys, we take a kind of a different look at it. We kind of look at it as a visualization of somebody who is in a hospital that I remember at some point in time who was dying or was very sick, who I prayed for with all of my heart For me, it was a 4-year-old grandson. I don't know what had happened to him, but his stomach began to swell, and we couldn't stop that swelling, and we thought he was going to have an internal burst. And I can remember just praying and praying and praying for that little guy, unlike anybody I'd ever prayed for. So when I came back through the work and I got into the resentment portion of it, they wanted me to visualize somebody who was in a hospital sick and that was bad, or in bed that was sick. And what the exercise was here was to take him out of the bed, put the person on the list in the bed, and begin to use this same type of prayer from the heart, but using this prayer right here. God, please show me the same tolerance, pity, patience I would cheerfully grant a sick friend. When that person offended, whether he was on my list then or moving forward in my daily life today, if I can remember this, it's going to help me a lot. This is a sick man, not from a place of judgment, but from a place of compassion. How can I be helpful to him? God, save me from being angry, thy will be done. And back on 111, it's asking me to do the same thing. And it tells me if I can do that and if I can do it successfully, then this is going to be my first principle of success right here is to never be angry. Now, that doesn't mean I'm probably not going to get angry, but for me, it's poisonous to stay angry. And so that's the first. So, principle number 2. Our next thought is you should never tell him what he must do about his drinking. And I think, sometimes out of goodness, I know my wife would talk to me. I've had a couple of different wives, and they would talk to me as David, you need to do something about your drinking. But then it would get to the point to where they would threaten me, if you don't do this about your drinking, or if you do, I mean, this is what's going to happen if you don't do that. Judges would do that. Sheriffs would do that. A lot of people would always tell me what I should do about my drinking, my acting out, my drugging, whatever I was going through at the time. But the next thought here of success is that they shouldn't do that. And, it's a beautiful principle when the other person can be at peace, even though I'm in misery. Oh, I hate that. I hate seeing someone else happy while I'm miserable. That's going to probably prompt me to do something one way or the other. So, if he gets the idea, keyword, the idea, anytime I get an idea, especially if it's in the wrong direction, that you're being a nag or a killjoy, then that chance of accomplishing anything useful may be zero. It doesn't say that you can't accomplish anything, but it says anything useful. And so my wives would begin to set boundaries, healthy boundaries. I know the wife that I'm with now is, very steeped in her faith. She's a long-term member of Alcoholics Anonymous and Al-Anon as well. She's a very, very good member of the Al-Anon program today and has been for many years. This just didn't start whenever, my stuff came to light in 2019. And I loved it that she never was a nag or a killjoy. But if that's happening, that's playing God. And so that's something that me, them, whoever should quit if you want your chances of accomplishing anything to be useful. So it says he'll use it as an excuse to drink more. He'll tell you he's misunderstood. This may lead to lonely evenings for you. He may seek someone else to console him. In other words, the revenge that we play sometimes as alcoholics and addicts. You don't do what I want, then this is what I'm going to do to you. And it says that we may seek to console someone else and not another man. So where have we seen that before in our book? I mean, we've had these directions before as we was coming up through this process of the work. And so if you would hold your place and let's bounce back to the bottom of page 80 and the top of page 81. Most of you will be familiar with this when you see it. But the bottom of page 80 says the chances are that we have domestic troubles. Perhaps we're mixed up with women in fashion we wouldn't care to have advertised. And that was absolutely my life for a lot of years, even sober, I'm sorry to say today. We doubt if in this respect alcoholics are fundamentally much worse than other people. Doesn't matter. But drinking does complicate sex relations in the home, and after a few years with an alcoholic, the wife gets worn out, resentful, uncommunicative. How could she be anything else? The husband begins to feel lonely, sorry for himself. He commences to look around the nightclubs for their equivalent, for something besides liquor. And that's what it's saying here on page 111. As we go back over to there, it will says that, there's going to be many a lonely evenings for you. He may seek someone else to console, not always another man. And I can tell you that that is absolutely not the fault of anyone else. That's the fault of this alcoholic. When I practice those behaviors, it's because I'm not spiritually fit. I am still in my illness. I'm showing up in a way in life that is not me, but it shows up as me. And this is where we learned about the self. And if you didn't listen to those series, if you go back to YouTube, we do recover, David G. All the way through the book, we talked about the self and how the self identified as us and how we begin to live out that scenario. And so, principle number 3, be determined that your husband's drinking is not going to spoil your relations with your children or your friends. They need your companionship and your help. It's possible to have a full and useful life. There's a promise. And so basically, what those few sentences are telling me is don't isolate. Maintain healthy relationships outside of the one that I'm in, even with the alcoholic or whatever it may be. And remember what the last part of it we read there, it is possible to have a full and useful life when you're caught up in the disease of alcoholism, even though you're not the one drinking. That sometimes and doesn't always seem to be the case. Now, again, I like to bounce around, so let's bounce over here to page 8 and Bill's story. I want to take a look at something here, and it would be, I guess, the second full paragraph, middle of the page, just about the last few sentences down of that paragraph. Bill mentions the fourth dimension in the book many times, but really this is the only place that he gives an accurate description of what that is. If you come down through that paragraph, almost to about the last 2 or 3 sentences, he said, I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. And here's the example of what that is. Here's the definition of what that is. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. Now, I never looked at happiness and peace become before being useful. But as a result of being useful, that's where happiness and that's where peace comes in. At least it has for me. And so as I go back to page 111, that's what it was telling me. The last few words that I read there, it is possible to have a full and useful life. And if I do that by practicing these principles, and I am spiritually fit, I don't care what she does. I mean, it affects me some, but it doesn't affect me to the point to where I have to nut out and act crazy and throw dishes and clear tables and all this craziness. And so if you're having trouble in a relationship in any such a way, these first 3 principles are going to be very, very helpful. So to have a full and useful life, to be patient and to be happy, that means that I'm on my way to what Bill described as the fourth dimension, this spiritual experience. So, though your husband even continues to drink, it says there. And what is that? I think on page 97, it gave us a brief description of that. And let's go there for just a second. And I know I jump around quite a bit, but I like to see, how the book connects to what I'm reading. I've always been that way. And so I think the last full paragraph on that page where it says, though an alcoholic does not respond, there's no reason why you should neglect his family. You should continue to be friendly to them. And here's the key words. The family should be offered your way of life. And what is that way of life? It's the 12 steps as outlined in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's an awakening. Should they accept and practice, key words, spiritual principles, there's a much better chance that the head of that family will recover. And even if he continues to drink, they will find life more bearable. And that's exactly the same thing that is telling us back over here on page 111. So we know women who are unafraid. That's a beautiful thing. I used to not think much about that, but fear, I hate fear. I hate to be in fear. I hate to see others in fear. And the book says, hey, we know a lot of women that are unafraid and even happy under these conditions because your condition is not going to take me hostage. I remember my son. This was some years ago. He was really struggling with a heroin addiction, and he had went to treatment. He had got help, and it wasn't his first time. It was the first of many times. But by the grace of God, this time it took. And so I ended up getting him into a Christian facility that also practiced the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. I did a lot of speaking for those guys in that day. In fact, about a month prior, the founder of that corporation, he came to me and he said, "Hey, David, I realize you do a lot of speaking, and what I would like for you to do is maybe talk about hope is alive." That's what they call themselves, hope is alive. And he said, "Could you mention us in your talks because you go to a lot of cities and you go to a lot of other places?" And I said, "I'd be happy to do that for you, but I might going to need some help from you." And he was like, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah, really." And so the time came a month or so later that I called that favor in. And we got my son there, and he ended up getting the help he needed through that program. It was a 2 year long program, and he did very good with that. In fact, he's doing very good today. He just spent the whole weekend with me with a little surprise he had about 3 years ago, and we just had the best time here. And so it's been a very good weekend to see him clean, to see him sober. But one of the things is, while he was there, the mother of his daughter had taken him to court and was going to take full custody away from him, his rights to see her altogether. And so, being the alcoholic dad in control as I was, I hired a couple of lawyers and we went after it pretty deep. But one of the things that came up in court was his behavior and how I'd taken the girl away from him and wouldn't let him see her while I had her, my granddaughter, during those times. And I can remember saying to the judge, because they asked me, "Is this true? Did you do that?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And it shocked them because they were expecting me to say no or to lie. And I said, "Yes, I did." And the reason why is because I'm not going to let his illness take my family hostage. And I don't care. And they're like, "Well, if you're this many years in AA and you've worked with that many people, why aren't you able to help him?" And I reminded them pretty quick, they probably didn't know very much about alcoholism or addiction, because to try to help the family member that you love is not always the best thing to do. The best thing that we can do is move them to somewhere where they can get help, because he knows how to push my buttons in a way that nobody else does. And I don't always react sanely with that. Sometimes I act very insanely, or I did back then. And so today we laugh about that, but I can tell you that wasn't the case back then. So, principle number 4, back to the book. Do not set your heart on reforming your husband, your son, your wife, your partner, whatever it may be, because I had my heart set on reforming him for I don't know how many different times. But remember, the compulsion that drives me to drink and drug and act out is the same compulsion that drives them to try to control, fix, and manage someone like me. That's exactly what was happening to me with my son. And even though I'd been around for so long, I was very active in working with other alcoholics. I knew all of this stuff. There come the day that I couldn't put it into practice. And I called a dear lady. She was a great friend of mine. She passed away a few years ago, and she was just black belt in the Al-Anon program in the community, and just a humble, gentle spirit, more so than most anyone that I ever met. And I can remember she said, "David, I want you to pray." And I said, "I'm not going to pray anymore." And she said, "Why not?" And I said, "Because God's not answering those prayers. He's not doing, what I'm asking, so to speak." And of course, we laugh about it today, but then I was very serious. And she said, "Why don't you stop asking him? And why don't you start thanking him? Thanking him that the boy is alive today, thanking him that there's a chance for his recovery, thanking him that people will be put into his life to try to help him with his recovery and not control him the way that you've been doing all these years. So instead of asking God for something, why don't you start thanking God for something?" And I tell you what, that was a complete different outlook on anything, that I'd had up to that point. So I began to practice that, and I'll be damned if results didn't begin to come. In a short time, he hit a bottom in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when it was minus 11 degrees. He was in a t-shirt. He had sold his phone for dope. You know the story with the addicts. I mean, it's all the same. And he walked into a church just to try to get warm, and there was an AA meeting going on there. And there was a guy that used to do these big book studies with me years ago that was sponsored by Joe, and I had been sponsored by Charlie. And we did these studies together in the beginning until he lost his voice. And he was there that night, and he picked up my son, and he took him and spent a few days with him and helped him and got him into something because by that point I was finished with it, and so was everyone else. And so the fourth principle here is very hard sometimes to do, but I can tell you if we let go of the outcomes, we let God be in charge of those things. What I can tell you, it's better than anything that I could have ever tried for myself. And I think page 80 in our book here really talks about that, letting go of the outcome. And so, page 80, if you'll hold your place and you go back to that, and we're going to look at about the fourth paragraph down, the story of a man who had ruined his business rival, by the things that he had done. And he wanted to make amends, but he was scared to make amends. But our book says this: after consulting with his wife and partner, and for me, that's one of the things that I do the most today. If I owe an amends, if there's amends left undone, or if it's one that's come up during my recovery, I always consult first with my wife, then with my partner, which is today my sponsor. But this man came to the conclusion that it was better to take those risks than to stand guilty before his creator of such ruinous slander. He saw that he had to place the outcome in God's hands, or he would start drinking, acting out, whatever it may be, and all would be lost anyhow. And so that's the same thing as telling us over here. Do not set your heart on reforming this person, because you may be unable to do so no matter how hard you try. Why? Because that's God's job. And sometimes I seem to forget that. So our book says that we know these suggestions are sometimes difficult. They're not unaware of this. They knew it was the same then as it is now for many of us. But you will save many a heartbreak if you can succeed in observing them, practicing these principles that we are laying out here. We've looked at the first four, there's two more. And so your husband may come to appreciate, he may not, but he may come to appreciate your reasonableness and your patience. This may lay the groundwork for a friendly talk about his alcoholic problem. Pretty heartbreaking to see someone you love so deeply going through something like that. I know it was with my son. I know it was with others. I know a woman right here in my town who has watched her son waste away from drug addiction for years and has done everything humanly possible to save this boy, and nothing, absolutely nothing has worked. And she's just heartbroken. But I read another book, and in that book, it says that God is close to the brokenhearted. And it says he saves those who are crushed in spirit. And I don't think that that applies anywhere any more better than it does right here to someone who is suffering from this, watching someone waste away that you love and doing everything that you can, and absolutely nothing seems to work. So for me, it's about finding that surrender. It's like, God, help me. Hell, I was always praying for God to help him hit his bottom. Hell, I need to pray for God to help me hit mine, because I'm the one trying to control and manage and fix and do all of these things with Him. Help me hit a bottom so that I can be more spiritually fit through the process of the work and these principles, and that I can begin to live in a way that is, pleasing to God and is a good example for my son or whoever it may be. So, it says, try to have him bring up the subject yourself, and good luck with that, with most people. I mean, to try to get me to talk a whole lot about myself, especially whenever I'm drinking or I'm using or I'm doing the things that I do, whatever it is that brings you to this study, then, that's not always an easy thing to do. But it says to be sure, and I think these are the key words, that you are not critical during that kind of a discussion. And sometimes that's a very hard thing to do. Attempt instead to put yourself in his place. So, principle number 5, coming right here. Let him see that you want to be helpful rather than to be critical. And I think at the times that I've done that with my son and with the loved ones that I was with, I think that that had more of effect than all of my hollering, all of my screaming at him, all of my threats, all of my empty promises, all of the things that I was doing, but to show him that I was there to be helpful rather than critical. Now, I set firm boundaries. Don't get me wrong. That's not telling me just to dust that stuff off and just let him do whatever he wants, because absolutely that's not the case. That's not what it's asking me to do. But it says let him see that, because I can tell him all day long, but unless I show him that I'm coming from a place of helpfulness rather than criticism, I have found that to be better than anything else that I could have done. So our book says when a discussion does arise, you may suggest that he read this book. And I love this because a lot of meetings that I would go to, or you may hear this if you're new or relatively new, you're probably going to hear this at some point. Just go to the top of page 112, read the first three words, and do that, and you're going to be okay. And the first three words is read this book. And, a friend of mine, she always says, hey, I even know meetings that are called page 112. But I love what she suggests. And she says, okay, if we're going to read the first three words in the book, then from page 112, we want to go back to page 32, and we're going to look at those first three words as well. And those first three words are more than once. So if you're going to read the book, do it more than once. And so our book says, read this book, or at least the chapter on alcoholism. And we know that that's chapter 3. And that's where it's going to talk about the self in depth, this state of mind, this condition of mind that shows up as me. I have no idea that these are the thoughts coming to me. I didn't wake up one day and think, hey, I'm going to destroy my family. I'm going to tear down everything that I've built in my career. I just did, but somewhere through the day, those thoughts were creeping in, and not being a regular practicer of step 10 at the time, I didn't know how to combat any of this stuff. And as a result, it piled up on me. It came to reality. But what I learned is that's a condition of mind I suffer from. And after the spiritual experience, as we go through the steps as outlined in the big book, I don't suffer from that condition of mind anymore. I'm rewarded by its opposite, and that's the power of God and the love and just the forgiveness that I have with people today. I'm in a pretty great place in my life today with other people. I haven't hurt anyone in a long, long time, and I'm very, very grateful for that. So our book says on 112, tell him that you have been worried, though perhaps needlessly, and you think you ought to know the subject better. Now, obviously, here we are talking about the subject of alcoholism, but that's not the subject that the book is trying to get us to see. If we go back to the doctor's opinion, XXVII, and I'm not real savvy with my Roman numerals, but I'm pretty sure that one is 27, Roman numeral 27. And if you read there in the smaller print, it says this: the subject presented in this book seems to be of paramount importance to those afflicted with alcoholic addiction. Now, for years, I would have told you that was talking about alcoholism or any of that stuff. That was the subject that was presented in the book, but it is not. You see, the subject that's presented in the book is the solution. It's God. That's the subject that is presented in the book. And if you go down to the very last full paragraph, it about the last sentence there, it says they believe in themselves and still more in the power which pulls chronic alcoholics, addicts, whatever it may be, back from the gates of death. That's the subject that's presented in the book, not the drunks, not all this other stuff. And so I know if I'm putting that in front of God, then I've missed what the book is trying to tell me to do. So back on page 112, it says this: we think you ought to know the subject better. And I know that that's talking about alcoholism. But then in a short time, I'm going to want to get to the real subject of the matter. And that's a power greater than self that can restore me to sanity. So, as everyone should have a clear understanding of the risk he takes if he drinks too much, not just him, but everyone. Show him that you have confidence in his power to stop or moderate. Now, we know that the book talks about someone who stops or moderates back on page 21, and they call that the hard drinker. Now, some people will say, oh, I'll lie to him, tell him, oh, I have every confidence in your power to stop. But, with my son, that wasn't the case. I knew he had the power. He just hadn't tapped into the power. That was the deal. I had to get him with someone who he could hear because he couldn't hear that from me. The reason why, he still had a lot of judgment, he still had a lot of resentment, he still had a lot of the things. So anytime I would start talking to him about God, his idea would fall back to the way I'd treated him. That was anything but godly. And my daughter was the same way. She went through a terrible, terrible time with addiction. And man, I've just watched her recover. There are a lot of heartfelt prayers there. And I've just watched her recover and turn into this beautiful young woman. She moved 5 states away from where she was at, really ended up with a great job and headed for a good career. And the mercy of God is a very good thing. So I always had confidence in the power, not so much them, but I knew that this power, if they could get to the point of surrender, that they was going to be okay. So that was my prayer, is not only that they would hit a bottom, but I would as well, and that I would come out with a new idea of what this looked like. And it turned out to be a beautiful thing. It really did. And so the book says, say that you do not want to be a wet blanket. And another friend of mine says, not even a damp one, you know? So, but that you only want him to take care of his health. And I think that's good advice. I really haven't ever paid much attention to that until now. And I can promise you that's something that I'm headstrong on now for sure, giving what has happened to me in the last couple of months. So, thus you may succeed in interesting him in alcoholism. In other words, give him the diagnosis of his own experience. Let him take accountability for that. He probably has several alcoholics among his own acquaintances. You might suggest that you both take an interest in them. And if you've read very much about Bill Wilson, and not only in this book, but in the other books that he wrote, you will always see that that was his greatest interest in life, was always, always to help another alcoholic, no matter what it may be. So drinkers like to help other drinkers, and your husband may be willing to talk to one of them. And so remember page 97. And if we hold our place right there and we jump over there for just a second, it's going to give me a pretty interesting tool here, because by this point, I have been working in building an arch through which I shall walk a free man. We've heard this many times over in this book. And so the first full paragraph here, it says, never avoid these responsibilities, page 97. But be sure you're doing the right thing if you assume them. And here it is, helping others is the foundation stone of your recovery. A kindly act once in a while is not enough. You've got to act the Good Samaritan every day if need be. And it goes on to talk more about that. But the foundation stone of my recovery is helping other people. And that's the same thing it's saying back here, is that drinkers like to help other drinkers. We do, whether we're drinking or whether we're sober. It seems that we want to try to help each other. And I think that's the greatest thing that's happened to me in this program for sure. But our book says if this kind of approach does not catch his interest, it may be best to drop the subject. And sometimes that's hard for an untreated Al-Anon to do, because I know, in being one myself, that was a hard thing for me to drop, because I wanted them to get well so bad that I was willing to do anything. But you see, that's not my job. That's God's. So the book says we had to stop playing God. It doesn't work. It's not that I don't mind doing it. Trust me, I do. But it's because, hell, it doesn't work. And so, but after a friendly talk with your husband, will usually revive the topic himself, but not always. He may not. He may not break it up again. And this is why it's saying it may take patient waiting, but it'll be worth it. So, principle number 6, we've looked at them all, right? 1 through 5. Number 6, meanwhile, try to help the wife of another serious drinker. In other words, it's telling me, carry this message, practice these principles in all of your affairs. If you do this, I promise you that you're going to have a better outcome, whether he's drinking or whether he's not, whether she's drinking or whether she's not. But these are the 6 principles. So let's summarize them. 1, don't get mad. Never be angry, it said. 2, don't tell him what he must do. 3, create healthy relationships. 4, let go of the outcome. 5, be helpful, not critical. And number 6, work the steps, carry the message, practice the principles in all of my affairs. If I can follow these 6 principles as laid out in these 2 pages, I promise you that my success rate's going to be a whole lot better, whether he's still drinking, whether she's still drinking, or acting out, or using, or whatever it may be. This is about me. It's not about them. Our only aim is to be helpful. I get that. But sometimes in being helpful, I try to do God's job. Where are we at on time, Jay? We're
Five
good?
minutes left, brother.
Okay. Thank you, brother. Thank you. Suppose, however, well, let's see. It says, if you act upon these principles, so it's calling me to action here, not them, me. If you, the reader, David, can act upon these principles, your husband may stop or moderate. Well, suppose that he fits the description of number 2. And if you remember back in number 2, we looked at this a couple of weeks ago. This is the real alcoholic. It said the earmarks, I know, but if we looked at his actions, and we did, if you go back and listen to that recording, you can definitely see that this guy is the alcoholic. The same principles which apply to husband number 1 should be practiced. But after his next binge, key word being after. A lot of times I want to try to act during. It's not telling me to do that. Don't do that. Because if I do, then my chances of being useful is going to be 0. So after his next binge, go ahead and let him run it all out. I know that that's what they had to do with me. Ask him if he would really like to get over drinking for good, and do not ask him to do it for anyone else, including myself. Just would he like to? And so I'm going to stop the reading right there, but I want to bounce over here to page 142 for just a second. And this is so powerful in our book, and we'll be coming up on this again in this study. But it says this in the first full paragraph, page 142. Next, he can be assured that you do not intend to lecture, moralize, or condemn. That's pretty hard if you're living in active addiction with someone. If this was done formally, it was because of a misunderstanding. I didn't quite understand the principles. I didn't understand surrender. I didn't understand alcoholism or addiction. It was because of a misunderstanding. That can be fixed. Now, if possible, express a lack of hard feeling toward him. In other words, it's asking me to practice forgiveness. At this point, it might be well to explain alcoholism, the illness. Step 1. Say that you believe he is a gravely ill person, with this qualification being perhaps fatally ill. But here's the question, and here's the question that we were looking back on page 112. Does he want to get well? Now, in my early days, I always heard we never get well here. I mean, that's all BS. We know that we get well. Why else would we be here? Cured? No. Recovered? Yes. Getting well? Yes. You ask because many alcoholics being warped and drugged do not want to quit, but does he? And here's the key. Will he take every necessary step, submit anything to get well, to stop drinking forever? I'm not asking for just 24 hours here. A lot of people say, oh, no, no. And, that's my story too. Thank God somebody said, hey, just stop for today. That helped me a lot. But here it's not asking that. It's asking, am I willing to do anything it takes to get well here? Go through the steps, have a spiritual awakening, help other alcoholics, practice these principles in all of my affairs, and do I want to stop forever? Now, whether I stop forever is another story. But if I have the willingness to do that, even just a little bit for that one day, then I've answered that question, yes. And I can tell you God will fill in the blank, or he has in my life. It's been a long journey, but today I have a very happy and a very useful marriage. I don't practice in the behaviors I once did. I don't talk to my wife in a tone that I once did. If that ever comes up, I back away from the conversation, and so does she. We've learned to practice these principles together, and it's made for a very, very happy marriage. And so, these are really, really good ideas in these back chapters. It shows me how to practice the principles in all of my affairs, even after the spiritual experience has taken place. That's my time for now, and I want to share it with you guys to share back with me. Thank you so much for letting me be here, Jay. Thank you for your service, and thank you all.